information, and there it is.
All right. Good evening. This is the Enfield Planning Board. It's August 9th. It's 6:30 and we are in the Enfield DPW conference room. And we are also on Microsoft Teams. Members present from my left.
Eric Russell.
Dan Kiley.
I'm David Frack.
Bill Vermeer.
Brad Rich. Tim Jennings.
Staff member.
Rob Taylor, and Whitney is out. Her father-in-law passed away suddenly, and so she's going to do the minutes from the recording.
Okay. Nobody from the public is here, so they can't comment. Select board report, Mr. Russell.
Yes, we had a good meeting on Monday. A couple interesting things. The community nursing program group, they have now collected the donations needed for the first year. So assuming everything keeps going, that program will be funded for the first year through donations. Buildings keep getting worked on, no big updates there. The one that would be sort of interest to this group is there's discussion of a potential urban compact with the state on Route 4, which would, and this was really just a, should we even talk about this? And what it would be if we had an urban compact with the state is essentially Route 4, the town takes responsibility for it. But then you also have, we can control speed limits, we can control access. A lot of these questions that keep coming up before the planning board around driveways and like the Jake's entrance being changed 3 times and not being quite what anybody likes, that becomes a town planning issue as opposed to a state planning issue. So that would be the reason to do it. But there's also, you have responsibility for the road. But there's a lot of negotiations. So basically at this point, we're looking into what that means. I don't know if Ed's talked to you about it yet.
Oh, yeah. I'm right in the middle of that. Yeah.
You know, what are the possibilities? That's really where it is. But it was driven because of I don't think they've even come to this group, but the group looking at Bobby LaCroix's land behind Shaker Valley Auto and the potential access challenge they're having with the state for driveway permit. They actually approached the town and said, hey, would you consider an urban compact? And then we would work with the town as opposed to the state. So very, very early stage stuff. But it definitely all fits in with the master planning and zoning rewrite and all the things that people have been talking about for the last few years.
Okay.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Any status on the renters ordinance?
No.
How do I get that on an agenda? Request that to be put on an agenda.
Email. So Kate's the chair. So
Okay.
email Kate and Ed.
Okay.
That'd be the way to get it on an agenda.
For the Airbnb thing?
It's for the Airbnb renters.
Yeah, short-term rental.
Short-term rentals, and
Okay.
the town really needs an ordinance so that they can enforce some
Yeah.
basic rules and regs.
Yes, and we don't currently have one, but one was drafted a couple years ago,
Yeah.
but never adopted.
It's becoming an issue.
Sure.
Summertime.
Always summertime. Rob, your report?
Yeah, so continue to be very busy this time of year. It's a lot of real estate stuff happening, speculation as well as actual. We're excited. We think we've got a new buyer for the Artec building next to Proctor's, which you guys probably remember was the ski business, all approved through here. It's the local franchise of Serve Pro, which is a restoration business that does storm and mold remediation type work. Kind of an interesting thing because they are actually residents of town. They live up on King James people. They have purchase and sale on that property. I've been in contact with them. It looks like it's going to be as similar as it can possibly be to what was there. Based on what I'm hearing, I am right now leaning towards no additional permitting needed for them. Obviously, as we get more details about exactly what they want to do.
How many trucks or vehicles do they have?
They have one van.
Oh,
So it's not, company headquarters, what they're talking about, office space, storage of some of their equipment, and dispatching for when they do have calls. Occasionally, they might have to come in late at night, which might be a little bit different from what Artec had been doing, although they would come in for ski races and so forth on.
Beautiful building.
It's a beautiful building.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It was right about the same time that Ed, town manager, Ed had reached out to that guy and said, hey, might be interested in renting your space for a temporary town office. And literally like the next week, they have an actual real buyer that wants to buy it. The owner called me up. He's like, what should we do? And I was like, if you got a buyer, sell it.
Right.
And it's worked out that I think that La Salette will be a nice temporary town office.
Yeah, that's the likely location for the library and town offices. The construction phase.
Another one in the similar vein, BSP Trucking has been vacated and is selling their property on Old Route 10 off of exit 15, right there by the highway. That was a trucking terminal, the tractor trailers, a little bit of warehouse space. A company has bought that property. It is a company that does what's called My Box, which is storage.
Yep.
They actually deliver a container. They have 3 different sizes, from like an 8x8 container made out of aluminum. It's kind of like a little sea box up to, I think it's 8x30 is their bigger size. They have a custom truck that can move those containers. So if you're gonna move, they come drop one of those boxes in your dooryard, you can stuff it full and they'll take it wherever you want. And so talking to them, that may be a similar, because of BSP being very similar. That was trucking and storage and warehousing and things of that nature. Obviously, it's in our commercial industrial zone. Not very many abutters. There is one rental property that's right next to it. I think it's a 2-family that's just went on the market. It might actually have already been sold. That's right there, but the highway, and the highway's 50 yards from the facility. So it seems like a great use that we can possibly move right in there, and even Steven, one use for the other. So that's happening. Obviously been talking, as Eric alluded to, a couple of the big developers still talking to Laramie Farms. So you guys have had at least a conceptual from, and we're talking to this other developer, Chinberg is the name. And they've got a real estate brokerage that does a lot of the legwork on the front end that we're working with, called the Gove. And this whole, the sort of access is one of their biggest challenges with that lot. Route 4 is fairly narrow through there. The state was, and I think the biggest thing with the state is there's just no certainty. You know, they feel like that the state took 3 years for this to develop. And this is not the kind of developer that wants to wait 3 years for results, or at least some certainty as to what they can and can't do. So they've been talking to us, as Eric said, about the urban compact. So busy. I think the sewer project is almost done. For the water project on
Yeah.
Maple Street.
They're doing punch list stuff on Maple Street.
Yeah.
For the water project.
We did have a little bit of bad luck there, just branching off, because I am in the public works building, with a couple of our pumps. I think it was, some of them were lightning related. So we had a couple of our pump, both sewer and water pumps that mysteriously stopped working. Some of them might have been construction related, others may have been lightning. So they've been working real hard on that. They're still fixing some of the damage from the storms and so forth. So, but any questions, I'm happy to answer, and obviously always available here.
After we've approved something, how long do people have to start doing it?
Well, on the zoning side, it's 2 years.
Yeah,
If you don't exercise your approval, basically, you don't make any progress on it, it literally dries out, after 2 years.
because I'm talking about the cell tower we approved
That was an interesting one.
a
So
year ago.
they have
And
pulled a
yet-
permit. They have pulled the building permit, so we're very excited
Okay.
about that.
Because nothing's happening.
They did that before the 2-year expiration.
I'm getting people down at the trailer park going, no, I thought the cell tower was coming.
Yeah, so they had to get zoning, they got a special exception up there.
Right,
And because of that, they came in just before the 2-year expiration and pulled the building permit.
okay,
And all indications were that they were gonna have it done by the end of this year.
Yeah.
We're very hopeful, because as you guys know, that's a very much needed communications upgrade for the town. You got that total dead zone
yeah,
from Dry Bridge Hill all the way out
Yeah.
to exit 17.
just as one of those, leave it to the state. It's been 16 months now that we've tried to put in the on-demand lights for the crosswalk in front of the infill village school. And they're still working on engineering. And having us pay for it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, another thing, I did attend the first session of the Housing Academy. That was a virtual, that was in conjunction with the New Hampshire HOP grant. They wanted some of us to attend, and so I did the first one last week, and there's another one coming up next week. There's 3 sessions, 2 of the 3 are virtual, and the second one, so first and the third are virtual, the second one is actually in person. I'll be traveling next week to Bedford for that session, but it was excellent. It was really good. New Hampshire Housing had a presentation about rentals in the state, and that's basically Grafton County is the highest median rental in the state of New Hampshire. And obviously it's very, very short supply. So what we're doing, I think is awesome, and they're very happy to have us there. And it's neat to meet a bunch of the other municipalities that have received some of the grants that these guys may actually be working with, some of them as well. So that was cool, and we'll have more to report. They all will be available if anybody wants to catch up. They're only a couple hours. They'll be available as recordings if you wanted to watch them. And the supporting materials are available on their New Hampshire Housing website, which they do a nice job. They're very professional with a lot of really, really deep data. You can really dive in and see. Talking about all the terms and sort of helping sort of bring us all up to speed on the issues basically they're trying to address, which we'll be talking about.
Okay,
Rob, 2 questions.
Yeah.
The apartment building on Main Street across Georgia, does you see a little activity going on there? Have they got a permit?
Yes, so he's pulling his building permit with Liam. That's Jim Kelleher. It's gonna be 6 units. I think it was originally proposed at 8. He's scaled it back a little because he needed some better parking to 6. But he has had a little trouble finding a contractor to do dirt work. He was hoping to get CPAT to do it, but CPAT is pretty much back down to just a couple of driveway kind of jobs around the town. And I think he's maybe by the end of the year going to be fully retired. I talked to Gene. So I think he's now going to work with DR Key out of Lebanon. And I think he's going to stick build. He's talked a few times about having modular or panelized construction. But I think he's now settled in on stick build.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the water project, maybe this is something Eric knows about too. What's the status of the well exploration, additional wells?
So they drilled a well last fall, and that one was below average production. They were a little disappointed. I mean, it's a crapshoot. When you stick a hole in the ground, sometimes it flows and sometimes it doesn't. That one, I think, was somewhere in the 20 to 30 gallons per minute. And they still have to pump test it and analyze the water. The engineering firm that we have is doing that work. And so they just drilled another well that came out better. So it's a higher production. Also will need pump testing and an analysis done. But the moral of the story is both wells, if they test well in terms of their production and their quality, will certainly help. I think that the new well was something like 40 something gallons a minute.
That's crazy high.
So, yeah, good. I mean, of course, the residential well is like an 8-inch casing. These are much bigger casing. It's a different drilling rig that they do for the municipal wells. And they also go down really deep. These are 700-800 feet deep wells. But the neat thing is it's in our marsh well field up on the end of Maple, basically on Moose Mountain Road, Canaan. So the connections will be much easier to do there because we already have infrastructure going right up Maple Street. And so I think those two will certainly help us a lot. They're not, panacea. They're not going to solve all of our problems. But as we all know, every little bit helps. And so I think we'll continue to keep drilling wells if we find more spots. And obviously, Dan, you talked with Selectmen about a couple of other neat options that we're exploring, as maybe bringing shaker village wells onto municipal, maybe, I don't know, there's things that we'll explore as possibilities, maybe drilling, obviously, we talked to these two developers, possibly drilling wells on their land, and they're certainly willing to work with us on those, so, yep.
Anything else, Tim? I'd like to skip over the minutes and get to our kickoff for the zoning rewrite. I think everybody knows Brandy Saxon of Place Sets in Windsor or Heartland. Which
Technically, it's Heartland. Technically, yes.
Okay,
We're the last house in Heartland before you hit Windsor.
and the gentleman next to her is the expansion of Place Sense. Rod, I forgot your last name.
Francis.
Rod Francis. So we have this grant for what, $63,000. We have to have it completed in, I guess, by the end of next July.
Mhm.
Otherwise, they cut off our funding. And we brought you in today to let you explain how you're gonna do it, what help you need from the planning board, what you expect. And I turn it over to Brandy and Rod.
Okay, we didn't
We
pre-plan who
actually-
was gonna
we didn't really
start.
do a good job planning this, Because you know what planners. So do you wanna?
Okay, yeah,
Ad-lib.
I can do
Come on.
that. Okay.
Adler.
So we have a, you have a scope of work obviously laid out in your grant application. Generally, we're going to follow that. The first step is to do a regulatory audit, which will look at the master plan and the planning policies and directions that come from that. It will look at the things that are troubling your code and permitting system, the things you give variances for, the list of pieces of the regs that are known to be problematic. It'll look at best practice. Your regulations are fairly dated in bulk, and you've obviously made some updates to them over time, but there's a lot of it that's probably fewer, whatever it was, 1992 or whatever, when you adopted it. And so we'll be looking at those sort of best practice pieces. And the overall, because this is a housing oriented, they will be looking what we sort of call housing barriers. So are there elements in your regulations that are in many ways likely unintended, creating barriers to the kind of housing that is known to be needed locally and regionally. And so we will have that audit done, and we would look at your current regs and against those things, and come back with some indications of areas where work is needed and some fairly high level discussion of directions to go. We would expect to have that for you to discuss in October. So that's phase one.
And then, following that, I think as part of that presentation period in October, we'll then be looking at, what your expectations are for the calendar, what your availability is between November and December. We know from experience that lots of boards and commissions, have a hard time meeting in the, somewhere between Thanksgiving and Christmas roughly. It gets tough. So and we also know that you're a review body as well for applications. So we want to try and gauge at that point what your workload is and what the next best steps are. Typically, what we would start doing is preparing sections of the draft regulations for your review and feedback at that point. But which section we start with and how fast we get rolling with that would be questions that we're sort of looking for guidance from you on. And you don't have to do it now, we'll do it in that October timeframe.
I would say that we often start with the administrative
Right.
section. Because you are actually a body that does development review, you are probably more familiar with your administrative section than many of the Vermont planning commissions that we often work with that don't do any development review. And so they actually don't know much about the procedures, and so that is often more educational than anything else, just so that you can write the rest of the rules now that you've understood how they get applied. But you know, that could be you know, a quick starting point to just go through and do that cleanup, make sure you're in full conformance with statute and all those pieces. So that could be a fairly quick and easy piece
Right.
there before jumping into the more meaty policy questions around zoning districts and such.
And the work, we've got a couple of other HOP funded grants on and in very different communities in New Hampshire. So, you know, the kind of analysis that we're going to end up depending on before we make any really strong recommendations would look at, you know, the pattern of development that you've got, you know, the recent history of that, it changing in a particular direction, to some extent matching that up with some demographic material too. Where is the community headed as a community? You know, what are the other sort of development pressures that are in play? And we will certainly be spending time with Rob trying to get a better grip on the kinds of things that are glitchy or problematic or cause friction in terms of the permitting process that could be resolved from at least from a regulatory standpoint. I mean, there are technical things like wells that don't work and so forth that is, you know, like that's out of the picture. But we certainly think that there's plenty of information that we can glean from Rob and others to help us with a better sense of where the changes need to be made.
So stakeholder meetings and formal stakeholder meetings are one of the task items that's early on in your project schedule. Rob's already informed us, since we had an initial meeting with him, that he's the primary firstest stakeholder.
I'm raising my hand already.
So we've kind of commenced that already.
Yep.
And gotten some sense of the things that are on the horizon here in Enfield. So probably one of the early things for this group to help us with is to think about who else you want us to speak with. We figure there's not a lot of reason to try to set up any of those informal meetings in August. It would probably not work. So we would probably look to September to start organizing those
Right.
Meetings. So if you've got a sense of who it is you would like to get perspectives from and hear from, pass that along through Rob and it'll get to us.
Right. And, you know, we're talking about, it could be, you know, could be community groups, it could be, you know, developers, it could be, you know, individuals involved in the development process, like engineers or other technical fields, people that you think that have important insights to share. That's really what we're looking for here. So, okay.
There may be some other town boards and committees.
Yep.
I know
That's what I
Enfield's
was thinking.
got a fairly robust
Yeah.
group of committees, so there may
Right.
be some others that have some crossover interest.
For sure. Yeah, I think typically in both Vermont and New Hampshire, and it's true of other states as well, there's always sort of this tension between conservation on the one hand and development on the other. And so what we encountered in plenty of communities is people that are in theory okay about more housing, but just not here or there. So, you know, and sometimes those are legitimate concerns, but there's, you know, a lot of the stakeholder interaction is going to be around trying to gauge actually what the community's appetite for really changing the amount and type of housing supply actually is, you know, or is there a generalized concern that this is going to be at the expense of land that either is, you know, that should be conserved or used some other way? We're conscious that you've got a fair amount of land in conservation already. You know, so it's one of those things that we need to sort of feel out, I think, and we're interested to hear what your view on these things is as well, so.
So we want to get the RPC involved in this or
I
not?
would say they could be a stakeholder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Regional Planning Commission.
Sure.
And I know they've been doing a lot of work on the regional housing need.
Yeah.
So
Right.
they've been sharing a lot of that information with you. So you have a more full sense. I think that would probably be the kind of feedback that they would be offering you is sort of what is needed in the region.
School district, maybe
School
more
district is definitely a,
superintendent or somebody like that.
Yeah. Amanda probably would be a good person to bring in.
Zoning board?
Yeah,
Zoning board,
yeah.
are members of the zoning board,
Remember.
select board.
No, I only am in awe there because right, the zoning board, their whole role is to sort of adjudicate the results as opposed to,
Yeah.
you know, an analysis of the types of
Variances. they're
cases
given.
that go to the zoning board
Yeah.
would be very valuable, you know.
Well,
Yeah.
that was my point, cause
Right,
I'm
right.
sure
But-
there's
but-
plenty of instances where they're sick of seeing them, right?
Right.
Yes, but that's not a reason to not have them.
Right.
You know, so like I get to work less if we do this, it's not. It's not really the argument we're looking for.
No, exactly.
I mean,
However, if like 90% of the cases are setback issues, then we should
Right.
know
That's
that.
definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we have in the past went and spoken to, you know, the zoning board types. I mean, it is obviously not their job to set the rules,
Right.
but they are users of them.
Right.
And so have a perspective that may be helpful as to what parts of them work for them and what's
Right.
not.
They'll definitely have insights into, you know, which bits work and which bits don't work, or things that really great on them, or things that have changed over time too. I mean, you know, they'll see patterns and stuff that maybe you don't, even though you're also involved in the review chain. And, you know, they'll have a sense of things that are different, but yeah, ultimately, they're also gonna be in that situation where they live with the rules that are handed to them.
Right.
And so there's that kind of fine balance that you've got to maintain there, but yeah. Yeah, okay.
I got a question. Do you do any review of communities that are similar to Enfield to look at their zoning and see if there's pieces that, you know, good ideas someplace else? I'm thinking of a town like Bristol.
Okay,
Dave and I went and toured Bristol. They got a lot of really cool stuff going on,
okay,
but they've got a lake and they've got a river, you know?
Yeah.
And those are just
And the downtown.
handed down.
right.
Yes.
Okay, so typically what we do is look to similar towns. You know, and we sort of cherry pick a little bit, but yeah, people that have attempted to resolve a problem in a particular way, you know, we look to see how they've done that. Certainly in Vermont, you know, we've got a pretty big library, if you like, of towns, their current regulations, their past regulations, and those kinds of things. In New Hampshire, what we've got is knowledge of the area, and
We have
sort
a
of
couple of New Hampshire examples that we actually pull from for the Vermont work.
for the Vermont work too.
Fairly
So
frequently,
yeah, that's basically that. So one of the things that we do is basically, yeah, like compare and contrast. It's sort of a standard. I mean, it doesn't come up quite with the audit, but at the point where we're starting to provide draft regulations, we'd certainly be doing things like saying, well, for instance, Bristol solved it this way, but you know, so such and such a town did something completely different, like Plainfield did it completely differently. So, you know, here's the pros and the cons with both. You're in a situation where you get to choose, but it's not going to be, you know, how do I say this without giving too much of the game away? We'll be pulling text and examples from other places because we know either it doesn't work or that it does, right? And that's what we'll be doing. So yeah, basically the short answer is yes, that's what we'll be doing.
So, one of our goals or dreams is to take a look at the existing zoning districts and modify, add, subtract, whatever. Can you talk a little bit about where that's gonna fit into the process, timeline wise?
Mhm.
And how best to sell that to the public?
Yes, so that is the big policy decision-making moment for the planning board. You obviously have the master plan, which has got some guidance about that direction, but then you have to translate that into an actual map. It clearly is an indication, and I think, you know, from having worked with the master plan folks, I know there's an interest in a revamp of the map. We definitely have a 1990s map. We can date them by the style of zoning districts. And it is time to relook at that and to, you know, to consider how you want to, you know, go forward into the future. And that will be the piece that community members, the people who live here, own property here, have the most interest in. So generally, we work up to it. We don't jump in right there. We work through, you know, make sure that you've got a good sense of the standards, you know, the site plan type standards that are going to get applied to development, so that when people come in, you can assure them that, you know, this is our baseline set of requirements. And also spend some time talking about defining the uses and making sure you sort of have I often kind of think of it as a menu to choose from, so that once you then start working on the map and defining districts, you are pulling from sort of a catalog of what you got. Like, what are we going to allow here? We have a sense of what the full range of options are. We often do quite a bit of mapping work at this stage, some of which, you know, depending on the type of community, can be focused in just sort of the area that's serviced with water and sewer, where, you know, you could actually get substantially higher densities because you can service it. Whereas out in the rural land, we kind of know what the carrying capacity there is, and can provide some quantitative analysis of what might be possible if you were to change, you know, these set of standards. This is the kind of change in development potential that you're looking at.
So yeah, part of the advantage of doing that sort of technical stuff at the first round, you know, to the administrative procedures and site plan standards, is that hopefully at the same time we're communicating to the public that this project is on. So they should be beginning to tune in. There isn't a good time for public engagement. We've kind of decided. So, for instance, August is really not good. Somewhere between Thanksgiving and Christmas, generally not very good. And then, you know, the select board also has their agenda, right? So you got to get a budget together. You got to get ready for town meeting. There's other things that make it really difficult to sort of find the sweet spot in the year to do this kind of stuff, which tends to also stretch it out a little bit. But in general, what we found is, you know, late winter, early spring sort of works. You know, before the kids are out of school, then you can start losing people's attention again. So you get these tiny windows of attention, and then a combination of ways of actually engaging the public is also really important. So, particularly since COVID, we've moved much more of that stuff online as a way of communicating and interacting with the public. We find we're getting a completely different profile of people engaging at different times and at their own pace, if you like, rather than who can make it to a 6 o'clock meeting or 6:30 meeting on a Wednesday night. So those things all put together mean that we will come up with a sort of a package of how to present changes to the zoning districts and a series of maps. At that point, you'll be hearing from the public a lot. That's usually the part that they grasp and that they're most concerned about. Like, what can I do and what's changing? So if wherever the map changes, you're going to excite quite a bit of interest. Sometimes those changes are not significant, like they're not necessarily going to have big implications for property owners. Sometimes they do. And so at that point, we're also working with you as a board to make sure that you know what the pros and cons are and how best to present and explain this information to the public at the same time, because it's one of those moments where you're going to feel really in the hot seat. Working that through So, I mean, roughly, I kind of given it away. I think that's sort of late winter, early spring time frame,
Mhm.
if that works for you.
That, I think that, and then we have in the scope of work, there's sort of there's a line item for some neighborhood meetings, and those would really be focused in on specific areas of town and looking at the zoning district pieces, mostly. So that, gives an opportunity. We typically avoid, when we're doing regulatory work, having sort of the big vision type meetings. We actually want to have more specific ideas to present to people to get feedback on, which doesn't mean it has to be the final idea or even just one idea, but we actually, when doing these projects, you've got to get down to writing, some number of feet,
Right.
on this line, right? So, you really do need to get to the point of being able to present some fairly specific options to the community and getting feedback on those and sort of move the conversation from the big idea down to, well, how do we implement the big idea on the ground? And so that's always challenging.
Right, so it's a really big contrast with the master plan, which sort of stays up there in that visiony space for a really long time and just kind of gives very broad direction to boards and commissions like you. Now, all of a sudden, you're in a situation where you're arguing about 5 feet, right? Should it be 20 or 25? That kind of stuff. And sometimes the 5 feet doesn't really matter, and then sometimes it really does. So that's where we find that, you don't want to be in a situation where you're just arguing about 5 feet, right? But you've got to have a really good sense of why you've made a decision for language one way or another. And then to some extent, it's sort of like a game, you've got to know when to fold it, right? Like just let it go, right? Otherwise, it's just going to get ugly. So that's, and that's an area, we obviously spend a lot of time in that mindset, right? Like a lot of what we do is sort of towards the end where it gets to be a bit, of a, horse trading situation and so we'll be like nudging you and saying, and just let this one go. Or no, if you do let this one go, a whole lot of other stuff unravels. So be really careful what you do, right? Like that kind of stuff is a key part of it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the other interesting parts of working on the regulations is the interconnectedness of the pieces. And so that's one of the places and one of the reasons it's really good to do the type of project you're doing where you're going to do a comprehensive revision. Very often we obviously work on just a small section of the regulations at a time. And some of that relationship of how all the parts interconnect can get lost. I think even and since you've actually got 3 separate ordinances, that's probably even more so to sort of start losing those crosses and connections between them. So the goal is to try, that's one of the things we'll be looking for in the audit is internal inconsistency. And we often find that, that comes up because over, a 20 or 30 year period, a community has made a series of small changes to individual paragraphs and not thought about how that connects back in to something else.
Which is the feedback we'll be getting from stakeholders, both inside the town as an organization and outside. People will be able to say, well, before 1998, we didn't have this problem. But then somebody, something changed, and then forever we've got this conflict, and we don't know how to resolve it. Or, those are the kinds of things that we're going to sort of work through. I think the other part of here is that road standards, the questions around water and sewer provision, we're in the service areas, how those things fit with any changes that we're suggesting are going to be really critical to get right. The interplay between those things can actually be pretty tricky. And then stormwater standards and a bunch of things that, we've all had a pretty good reminder over the last couple of weeks about why
It matter.
why it matters and why it's different now from what it was, say in 1992, right? So the data is pretty compelling. It means lots of things, about dimensional standards and a whole bunch of other stuff about making sure there's enough space for stormwater to get collected and managed, which we've not been very good at historically, I would say. And we're getting taught now the consequences of that.
The hard way.
Typically that's the way we learn, right? So we'll be paying attention to that kind of, and so where people will see things coming from us in draft form and be shocked at the difference, in terms of the amount of area devoted to that, or just even the complexity of that section of the document. And that will be reflecting, what we've been learning out there.
Yeah, there's a couple of areas, where I would say in the last 10 years, there's really been a need at the municipal level to sort of beef up what the local regulations are saying. So one of those is in relation to stormwater. I think there's also been a lot of movement around parking requirements and thinking about how the parking and they're actually not disconnected, are they? So, that tie in there, those are definite pieces that, when we were saying before about we'll be looking at sort of contemporary best practices, those are things that have definitely changed in 30 years, in terms of what, the engineering recommendations are.
And dirt roads and your management of dirt roads, do you want more people living on them? Do you want to try and discourage that? What are you going to do about it? If they keep on failing, as a consequence of storm events or something, do you want more of that? Do you want more people calling to complain about the fact they can't get out of their driveway? But what do you want to do about it? To some extent, this is where this stuff kind of ends up being played out. So, which is the other part of going back to some of that early audit work, where we'll be looking at the pattern of development and trying to figure out, certainly in plenty of Vermont communities, there's tiny amounts of additional housing that's been added in the last 30 years. I'm talking, 3-4 houses in a year, right? Really small. But they're all on dead end or nearly dead end dirt roads that are a long way from a paved road and are incredibly expensive for the town to service, just in the normal run of things, and incredibly difficult and dangerous on a certain level to do, during or after a storm event, right? So you get into these, what would it, do you really want to have that pattern of development continue? How realistic is it to even think that you could develop regulations that would dissuade people from doing that and direct that kind of development activity in a different direction? Those kinds of things end up being, important philosophical kind of conversations to have, but that end up being with very practical language about, how it's gonna work. Yeah.
And then ultimately what we are building to is a strategy for getting you from nicely drafted new regulations to adopted regulations, which is of course the hard step. Writing it's easy, getting it adopted.
Yeah, it's different.
So as we go along, it will be important to, and this is a really significant role of the board to foster a base of support for the regulations and the process as you go along. So, we always get to the end of these projects and we have some dissatisfied customers, shall we say. We know we're going to happen. If they're the only ones who come to a hearing, that's a problem. So we also need to have people in support of what you're trying to achieve come and speak as well. And that really only happens if that support is nurtured through the process and you kind of build it and sustain it. going into that adoption phase. You know, you are in New Hampshire in the unenviable position of needing to get that townwide vote to get this done. And it's hard. So it really is a political process at the end, that needs to happen. And, so I think Rod referenced a little bit the horse trading, but, perhaps that's a step too far to say, but, there is
Yeah, right.
political reality of what can get adopted and
Yeah.
what,
Right.
you know.
It goes
And-
to the importance of outreach
Yeah.
and then the more outreach we do. I mean, I think with the master plan, we did a ton of outreach and that paid dividends. We absolutely did. We'll have to do the same thing here.
Yeah. And, it doesn't, it doesn't mean that you just end up with, team A and team B. But, it means that listening carefully at the beginning, in particular, getting the feedback, having the regulations that you're suggesting be adopted, reflect both, your views as a body, your informed and thoughtful kind of views, as well as reflecting where you think the community is going or what they're willing to, what they're able to accept. And then, making sure that particularly, again, in that kind of social media space that we're stuck in, when it comes down to the hearings and the townwide vote, that, that there are enough people informed well enough to make a good decision, right? Yeah. So rather than just, having 12 people on Facebook,
Well, I think with the master plan and hopefully this process as well, when you give so many different opportunities for people to weigh in their opinions throughout the process, it helps you in the end. I mean, they may disagree, but they're not gonna feel that they weren't included.
Right, that's the
Right,
key,
and
right?
so-
Yeah, I think that's really key, to be inclusive.
Yeah.
And to be genuinely inclusive and to be able to demonstrate that you've met that threshold, I think is really important. I think it gives the select board confidence then to, there's other stakeholder groups here that you're gonna need to carry with you, as you go towards a townwide vote, right? So, that are gonna be really important.
Anything else? Any questions?
Oh, you have a question? Yeah, go
Why
ahead.
don't you go ahead and.
No, you have your question first, because I had sort of a kind of wrap up, like
Oh.
step ahead statement, so you should go first.
Otherwise, she's gonna wrap up. Yeah.
So I'm just gonna toss this out there for discussion. It's not something I'm particularly married to or think is a strong position to take, but I just want to toss it out there for just to chew on it. And that is, my first suggestion is the ordinance that we currently have is poor, bad even.
You're being generous.
Yeah.
Places, a lot of
It's
places.
contradictory.
And so that's
Yeah.
the kind of feedback I was expecting to
Yeah.
probably get. So I think to carry that a little further, I might say that whatever the goals were that were articulated or written down as to why they put that zoning ordinance in effect back in the 90s, basically have not been realized. And so we're dealing with a document, I think, that is familiar. We sort of know what it means and we know how to apply it to various applications that come up, but it's not really accomplishing what I think the current board here and many others want to see. And I don't think it reflects the master plan very much at all. So here's the thing to chew on. I'm wondering if we can move this thing along at all, in your audit part. If you simply maybe look at the town as if it had no ordinance, we've got a brand new master plan. And so we just want to start fresh. We want to start with a clean slate. At least that's what I think. Without dragging the old ordinance into the discussion in a big way. So there's just a comment. Again, I don't know, I haven't really thought all that through, but so would that move things along quicker? You're still gonna need to do an audit to understand our development patterns. And
Right.
so forth, but would that shorten that at all?
So the audit is actually part of the HOP program.
Yeah.
They actually do want you to do some sort of an assessment of what your current regulations, particularly in relation to housing, and I think we can focus in on that with the audit that we're going to do, and narrow the focus down and, you know, not be like, well, over here you require, you know, this amount of, you know, parking spaces and
Yeah.
everything, or you say you can't put them over there, you know, it just doesn't work together. Like, we don't necessarily need to do that. We can say more in the housing realm with the audit. What we find is that the audit actually has two values to the board moving forward. One is it really is an opportunity for us to have that conceptual conversation about, these are the things that aren't working, and these are options, these are other approaches that could be better. So it gives you guys a chance to give us some guidance before we start on the blank page, and we will start on a blank page. We will not start with track changes on your current document.
Excellent.
I mean, I'll go one step further than Tim. This didn't work the day it was adopted. If you look at the map, their map was based on, this is downtown, and the further you get away from downtown, the bigger the lots have to be. Doesn't make any difference if there's a friggin' lake there that's on the ground, has lots that are half acre,
0.4.
0.4
Yeah,
acres,
we just,
but
yeah,
it's in an R3 district.
Yeah.
Because that's the map we drew
yeah.
in 1992, and you can see it. It's right there.
I mean-
It says Crystal Lake.
Yeah.
It's
It says
definitely
R3.
vintage. It shows its age
Yeah,
quite well.
yeah.
It's a very clear example of
Oh,
its
yeah.
Yeah.
type.
I don't know who was involved in it. And I'm
It
sure,
took 3 times to pass it.
okay,
They're all dead. and
that's
they're all
good, thank you.
And if they're
But
not-
why, but how did they die? That's what.
I can't think of a single provision that I just
Right,
must see carried
Right.
forward.
Yeah,
Must
right.
keep carried forward.
that's really good information for us to have. So we're not gonna do the forensic audit, we're not gonna like tease out going, well, this is 6 feet, what about 7? You know, like, we're not bothering with that stuff, okay? But we will, there are insights that you're gonna get, particularly from the housing stuff. And the other part of the challenge is, sooner or later, you're gonna end up in this situation where people are gonna be saying, this is what I've got now.
Right.
What are you proposing? And so you gotta have some understanding of what you've got now and what's the
In order to
it is
communicate the change.
Right.
to actually
Yeah.
encourage the change to go in the right direction, right? So
Yeah.
there's that kind of conceptual problem.
We just don't want to limit you in any way.
Oh,
No,
Right.
that's
we
good.
won't-
No,
we
we
won't
won't
take it
take
that
it,
way.
yeah, we won't take it that way.
So the other value, and so Rod was sort of alluding to that, is that it does become the basis of your argument for why you need to make changes.
Yeah.
So you
Right, yeah.
have, you know, you have a
Because we're
this
reflecting
evaluation.
what's on the ground.
Right.
Yeah. You have this evaluation to point to as one of the
Right.
reasons behind your decision-making.
And I
So
think
it's-
your observation that the purpose statements, you know, for each of those zoning districts or the purpose statement for the regulations overall, that it's not been accomplished. I think it's a really important statement to,
Unintended
and has,
results.
yes,
Right.
exactly, and it's
Right.
and has had unintended and unfortunate consequences. So there's a couple of things I think that's really important to convey, and it's really important to hold on to that picture. I think there's one other piece, which I want to add here, which is also consistent with the fact that these regulations were developed in the early 1990s, and it's from that era in planning in this part of New England, which is sort of wishful thinking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in theory, it would be really nice if there was, like imagine that map on the wall, that there was one village right in the middle, in the bullseye, right in the middle of that
Right.
map. And that you could organize it so that there were small parcels around that village, and then as you went out in any one direction, there are larger and larger parcels until you magically got to the edge, and then you'd cross over the town line, and that whole thing would start all over again as you
On the
went
other
toward
side.
Plainfield, and
Right.
you'd get a repeat.
Right.
Such a idealized, theoretical kind of idea about settlement patterns. It's really good in the textbook. It looks great. You can make great pictures out of it. You can sell it. It just happens to be completely untrue,
Yeah.
right? So, which is a kind of a bummer. And the obvious things here, I've been staring at this map the whole time I've been here because,
Right.
and I'm like, yeah. Like you got some issues.
There's a lot of terrain, there's a lot
Yeah.
of things to work with, and I would say that's one of the other real differences when we said it's a real 1990s zoning map, we can see it. It's what we can do with mapping now because of the information and the data we have is so much different than what was
Yeah.
available. I mean, so we shouldn't perhaps pick on the 1990 planners so badly. So that idea that you would do zoning districts a certain distance off the road, that made sense when you didn't have
The kind of information that we've
kind
got.
of information
Right,
we've got. And so, it's time to rectify that, to line your districts up with the parcels and
Right.
to take into account much more of the natural resource and terrain, the physical constraint information that we now know about.
And Rob's talked about, the nightmare of, huge numbers of people being non-conforming
Yeah.
around Crystal Lake and so forth. And that's,
Yeah.
A huge amount of his workload. Yeah, we need to resolve. Can we resolve all of it? That's going to actually be interesting to try and figure out. Is it a problem? It's definitely a problem. It definitely needs to be addressed. And involved in that process is some kind of acknowledgement or acceptance that what is on the ground is what is on the ground. And
Right.
realistically, for the next 40 or 50 years, absent some kind of like earthquake type calamity, that's what you're going to have. Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, right. So,
I think,
Well, one step further, there's probably not more than a dozen more units around Crystal Lake than there were in 1992.
yeah, it's probably also a reasonable conclusion that it was probably fairly close to being built out in 1992. It's probably built out now, and it sort of is what it is,
Right.
right? Yeah.
And I think, particularly with the lakefront pieces, there's always a little push-pull here because the existing pattern is usually extremely non-conforming, predating
Right.
regulation. The question is, if you had it to build all over, would you actually build it like that? The answer is often, well,
Probably
no. There are some access and safety issues here that we
Right.
would really
Right.
prefer have been done, do a different way. So the question is always, what are you gonna allow going forward?
Right.
You want to try to minimize the complications for those existing property owners, but you often are trying to kind of come to some mid-ground between what people are willing to have as being possible for new things going forward versus how much they want what they've got right now to be perfectly legal.
Right. And we are talking about really basic things here, like emergency vehicle access and those kinds of things, which, we've just driven around a little bit. I mean, honestly, you've got some dead end streets and stuff that
Oh, yeah.
modern fire apparatus is going to have a really hard time getting in there. They might get in, but I don't know how they're going to get back out. Right. And that's today, not
Oh, yeah.
the middle of February. Right.
Yeah.
So, so there's really basic things for us like that, which we won't overlook, but I think that those things are really important to get.
I mean, we often do, as part of the audit, a more of a GIS analysis. Here you don't actually have that much of sort of a urbanized pattern. So when we've done, communities that have more of a downtown and block structure, we've done more of that analysis to sort of understand what is the built form and pattern, kind of neighborhood by neighborhood in a larger downtown village area. But even if you did it sort of just in your service area, and you can get a sense of well, what would it take to make 80% of the lots in this area of town compliant? That's kind of typically thought to be reasonable, right? Like 20% nonconformance is, you can live with that. When it becomes 50% nonconformance,
There's something wrong.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
So we often run that little analysis just to see,
Right.
what is that level of
Right.
nonconformity?
And we'll go back to the master plan and look at where you are, through that process, where you decided you want direct growth and what kind of growth, right? And then we'll move forward with that. So we won't be sort of trying to, polish up your existing language. We'll just, be developing new language to try and achieve those things that you've already, through the master plan process, established, right? So.
I think there are, you asked about stakeholders, and we need to communicate that list to you guys, so, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think there's a couple of unique communities within our town that I'm wondering if we shouldn't engage as a community, not necessarily that they're gonna have a committee or whatever that represents them, but one is Shaker Village. Actually, use our map for the very first. Mark, but these lots here.
You want a marker?
No, that's fine. In as much as they've got the historical Shaker Village that's there, they have unique interests and needs and plans, and then the community, the residential community that's built up around it, I think are all really tied together. It's a unique housing situation here that we don't really have anywhere else in town. So I hope we can. I don't know if it's a zoning district that just encompasses them or whatever, but that we really allow for those folks to, because there's a condo, I think there's a couple condo associations, homeowners association, there's the museum.
Yeah.
Right.
The others we talked about are the lakes, perimeters of the lakes. And that community seems to me to be the one that's has a lot to say, and I think at least we should hear what they think our lake, our community should be, of course. And down here, Enfield Center, it's another pretty unique community. And I've noticed a couple of applications we've had, and one was to split a lot, make my lot a little bigger and this one a little smaller, and it seemed perfectly, completely reasonable why that shouldn't happen, but we couldn't. We were tied, answer tied. But that community there is another group that, like, it's almost a separate village. And there are others, but I just kind of wanted to point to the corner.
Yeah.
Eastman.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking at that down the bottom and
That's really good to think about, particularly as we advance into the project and are thinking about those neighborhood meetings, of actually thinking about how to structure reaching out to, there are different parts of town, different neighborhoods.
Yeah. Topography's really kind of kept you in fairly small, bit bigger than a hamlet, but like you don't, your settlement pattern's pretty interesting, actually. Yeah. You got some big spaces in between,
There's a lot of big spaces owned or
by the street.
controlled by Fish and Game.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So thanks, Tim. That was right.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Right. I think that adds to the character of the town in a lot of ways. All right. Yeah, that was very useful remarks. Thank you.
So I have a question about how PlaySense as a planning partnership is going to work with us.
Okay.
Do we get both of you? Do we get one of you? Have you guys thought about that at all?
We have. You'll get both of us most of the time, is
Great,
what we'd say.
great.
Right.
We, scheduling being what it is, there may be instances where one of us does one thing and someone else is doing something else, but on these zoning revision projects, we are doing it
Good.
as a duo for the most part.
Right.
That works pretty well. We each have, Rod has a really strong background in actually administering regulations and being
Right.
being a pragmatic
Right,
planning director
right. So,
type.
right, so
you know.
more than 15 years of being a planning director and either being the manager of a zoning administrator or being the zoning administrator or both. So, yeah, I know what it's like to be on the wrong side of the desk. And, Brandy's, as you know, got really sophisticated mapping skills and so forth. So I think, we're a pretty good combo. You should expect to see both of us most of the time. There'll be times when Brandy will be doing more of the talking than I will be, or, there might be a meeting conflict where one of us is.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Eric?
One other thing we should include is, because it's part of the selling it to the public thing, as we look at different zones is, and you sort of alluded to it, both what are the sort of generic costs and revenue side? Because obviously 5 acre lots both cost a different amount in town services and generate a different amount of revenues.
Mhm.
And we can create those estimates as we're going through. Because, a lot of people are interested in developing tax base and, I talk to some folks, they think like, oh, well, having 5 acre lots with really big houses on them builds tax base, but if you do the numbers, a 10 unit building in the village generates more taxes and costs less than, 5 houses on Bog Road.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So having some basic analysis
Yeah.
of what the different zones mean is also an important
Yeah.
important piece for people to consider.
Right.
The ability to have cluster housing.
Right, how does that, what does that mean
What
if
is that?
you allow that?
Right.
Yeah.
So, the one thing I think Tim made me think of this too. So, but it's kind of discussion of like, there's nothing really in your existing regulations that you really want to preserve. The one, and in that in particular, that the purpose of these regulations, they've not been accomplished, right? So the one important kind of flag I want to add to that conversation is that obviously, when you think about it, there's an interaction between various markets and the way we frame and think about regulation. So right now we're all hyper aware of the housing crisis because it's playing out, in a really personal way right before our eyes. Can't quite figure out exactly how we got here. Some of the explanations are really complex and kind of global. Like we could be in Vancouver and having the same kind of Vancouver, Canada, having the same kind of conversation about the housing crisis, or Sydney, Australia, or here, right? Like we've all so there's something big going on here that we're not entirely sure, how to really explain the problem, but we know sort of what the problem is right here in Enfield. When we rewrite the zoning regulations, we're going to be kind of doing something that will nudge and direct the market, hopefully, in a way that's going to work and be effective. But sometimes you don't get to override people's personal impulses. So you can make it more difficult for people to build a 5 acre, you make mention on 5 acres, 4 miles up a dirt road, but you can't stop them from doing that very easily, right?
I'm not making any suggestions on what you should have for zoning laws. What I'm suggesting is that some basic financial analysis should be included.
Yes.
Around what that means, because dirt roads are more expensive than, a paved road in the village and,
yeah, I think having an awareness of that
is an important piece of context.
Right.
As people think about what we should do.
And I think, I'm sure we'll find it to some extent here. It's more apparent in the communities that we've been working with in Vermont that they're kind of aging out. And so you've got older couples in older homes that are remote on dirt roads. And they're usually multi-story houses. And, you know, the first phase is they make some modifications to the house so that they're all on one floor. And then one or other of the couple has a fall or some other health, you know, crisis, and then they move out or pass on. And then you've got the remaining person in the house who would prefer to move out of the house, but wants to stay in the community, and there's nowhere to go, right? There's just no, and so they struggle on. They've got adult children who are all over the country trying to manage them, remotely. And it doesn't work very well. And then you've got new families that would like to move into town and cannot afford that house because there's just no way they can make it. So you've got this complete mismatch, and it's sort of, there is a market aspect to it, but there's also kind of a social and community aspect to it. And we see it probably more clearly in Vermont than we do here in some ways. Where literally, like, it's like a whole generation of people are sort of like reaching the end. And then those towns are the ones that are like, it's getting really expensive to run a plow up these roads with hardly anybody in those houses in the first place, or even worse, get an ambulance up there. All right. So that's actually kind of what we're trying to deal with in a certain way here.
Yeah.
And I think those are really important questions.
Yeah, no, and we have some simple impacts that, we have bus routes that are an hour and a half long.
Right.
So, the end of that bus route is not an attractive place to buy a house if you have kids.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Right. Yeah. That's a perfect example. Right.
Yeah.
Right. How long is my kid's school bus ride? Right.
A good long time to learn how to misbehave well on the bus. I had an hour-long bus ride.
Yeah,
as a
you know
kid,
what?
and, I should have fun.
Yeah, I was hot wiring neighbors' cars, so it was, it's not a really good, So yeah.
So yeah, is there other observations, questions?
I gotta.
Mhm.
I've tried to state this in writing a couple of times, and I haven't really been satisfied with what I've come up with, but I think, and this is where we may differ somewhat between us on philosophy, and maybe that's the right word. But I think there's a point fairly easily reached where you begin to establish regulations that are aiming for a specific outcome that is far too detailed for what reality will actually produce. And that is something I would like to see we avoid, that we recognize that while, the baby booming generation is passing through this world and passing away, what we write an ordinance now that's kind of addressing all these situations, in a few years, we're all gone. And then you're going to have a completely new situation to deal with. So I think our ordinance needs to be very flexible, and to recognize that often individuals and developers have got some pretty dang good ideas that if we let them exercise their creativity, let them make a profit, that we don't know where things will go, but we know we might have a small list of things we definitely want to avoid. But as far as to how to push it too far, and I like the word nudge, but not push.
Right.
Yeah, the box doesn't have to have sharp corners on it. The kind, be like a balloon, it can inflate a little.
Mhm.
Okay.
But that's just one of them.
Anyone else? Thanks a lot for coming in, guys.
Okay.
You're welcome.
So you can
Nice to
expect
meet
to see us again in October.
Yeah,
Okay, our work sessions are the second Wednesday of every month.
Right.
okay.
So,
Hearings are the fourth.
yeah, our goal will be to get you an audit probably before the end of September.
September,
So you
yeah.
have, you know, ideally 2 weeks
At least 2 weeks to look at it.
to look
Uh-huh.
it through, and then
Yep.
we would plan for that meeting to be a chance to review sort of the key findings and sort of talk about
Yep.
kind of those bigger, broader directional pieces, and we may have a little bit more depth to the schedule and things like that at that point to
Yeah.
talk about as well.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
think logistically, I think you said you wanted to develop a list of stakeholders.
Yep.
Yep.
If we think of those, should we pass them to David and pass to Rob?
I think that would be appropriate. Pass them to me or to Rob, and we
Don't like their
will,
way.
we will try to send you one list
Yeah, that
Sounds
sounds
good.
great. Yeah,
rather than drips and drabs.
yeah, that's fine.
Excellent.
Okay, all right. That sounds great.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, have a good
Thank you.
evening.
Thanks
Thank you
again.
very much for your time.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, see you later. See you, Rob.
Take care.
Okay. I guess we're off and running.
Up and running, yes, we are.
So
Gonna get
second,
exciting.
our second big project for those of you who have been on this board for a while. Let's go back to the minutes from our July 26th meeting. Anybody have any comments?
Anybody need a coffee? It's hard coffee.
I don't have any changes. I have a question, so I can, now or after.
Now is a good time as any.
On line 203, we talked about, I think it was, Dan who said that a condition, for,
Collins?
yeah, we would have to, they would have to connect to the sewer system. And has that been looked at? And are we in good standing there? Or is that something that, they might be able to not connect?
I think Rob has some info on that.
I have lots of info on that. So I went back and researched select board minutes, and we do have a folder on our common data drive, just essentially electronic files. And I did find letters that were sent to property owners in the expansion district of the sewer and water, where waivers were granted. But it was made very clear that the waivers were granted to the property owner. And they were non-transferable for sale. So basically, people had made investments in septic systems at a,
Sure.
reasonable distance.
Yeah.
If you look at the minutes, they'd say, oh, the septic system was installed in 1978. We're not giving them a waiver. And that septic system has certainly run its life and
Right.
life cycle. But if somebody had installed a septic system 5 years prior to the installation of underground sewer, they said, okay, we'll give you 15 years. And so those letters went out, and we do have copies of those. We also have this really neat tracking sheet where each year the select board were updated as to the status of people connecting and so forth. And there is specific mention of this property, 453 Route 4. And it does say that the waiver was granted, but it's non-transferable. So if it sells, the other thing that Public Works Director is very insistent on is that the waivers were granted for the existing use.
Mhm.
When the use changes, that's when you guys really get an opportunity.
All
It's
bets are off.
it's like a subdivision. If somebody's doing a subdivision, you have to they prove to you guys that a septic system can be put in. Or in the case of a housing development, how are you gonna accommodate
So there's
subsurface?
a couple things going, change of use, right? And it's a non-transferable.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
pretty clear.
It's gonna be tough on them because it's gonna be expensive. That's the thing, but I think, this is obviously an opportunity for them. And I had a conversation with John Pellerin, he came in my office yesterday. I said, you know, the unfortunate thing is that it wasn't connected 2 years ago because the sewer development charge from Lebanon was not in place at that point. Would have been way less expensive to do it. But I emphasized, you know, we gotta get you connected because 2 years from now, it's gonna be even more expensive. I think they're just sort of, he admits to me that they're upset that Bob LaCroix got the sweet deal and that they're not gonna get the sweet deal.
Yeah.
True.
Now, I recall that Mr. Pellerin said that his attorney had looked at some of the documents and thought it was okay to use the existing system. Has he changed his mind on that based on this conversation?
His attorney was talking about whether the waiver would go with the property as opposed to the owner. Again, we sort of got him on the fact that the use is changing. You
Mhm.
know, how many people went into that bathroom at the Shaker Valley Auto dealership? I mean, you go in there to buy a car, maybe somebody might pop in there once or twice a day. But if they're gonna have 100 people in there from 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 9 o'clock at night, the usage of it is gonna be way more. And they, you know, they've said, oh, it was connected to the car wash. Even I would posit that car wash is a totally different demand on the system.
Yeah, gray water.
That's gray water
Absolutely.
versus.
Is it actually connected to the car wash? Septic system?
Septic system, that's what the claim was, right?
Is,
Yeah.
is the car wash actually?
Is it going to a dry well or something? I don't know.
Septic.
Yeah.
Lovejoy Brook is real close.
Well, that's the other side of it is it's also in the wellhead protection area.
Yes, very close, yeah.
So they realize that they've got an uphill battle there.
I think John is starting to resign himself to the fact that that will most likely be a condition of your approval. I know, again, coming back to the Public Works Director, he is very insistent that the use is changing. So the demand on a private septic system for 7 days a week, if possible, 100 people can be significant, and we really should.
Although, I think that may be two different things there, though. Absent the letter that said the waiver was only for the property owner up until the property was sold. If you didn't have that, there's nothing about change in use that would require, our ordinance wouldn't require a municipal connection.
Well, just like I said, I mean, so say it was a single bathroom, and then it became a
Well, yes, but-
multi-family
But you,
development, it's gotta have a new system. You know what I mean? That's the change of the use.
Well,
Change of
right.
use would kick in a new
but
need.
there's some
for a
changes in
septic
use that wouldn't affect the septic demand, the septic loading.
system. Correct,
Right.
right, that's true, yeah.
So it's not just change of use that forces that issue. It's, and it sounds like it may be moot anyway, because if there's a letter there that said, we're gonna give you a waiver for a period of time, then the property's sold, and okay,
Right.
that seems to trump everything.
And we do use, site plan review as an opportunity to bring things up to current standards.
Yeah.
Whether it's lighting or parking or
Which in our case is,
whatever.
if the letter wasn't on file,
Right.
then you could say you've either got to have that septic system re-engineered and proven to accept it,
Yeah.
or you got to put a new one in, or you got to connect to the town sewer. Right? And
Well, and that's where it might require it because we don't allow septic
They
systems.
don't
there
allow
anymore.
a septic system.
So if the current septic was deemed inadequate,
You
then
have
they would
to
be
connect.
required to connect.
Mhm.
Right,
Correct.
that'd be the logic. So my question is, not necessarily related just to this property, but for all the property owners along that. If my memory is correct, all the exceptions were for 20 years.
Right.
As the town, which is up in like 4 or 5 years?
It's 2028.
2028. It may be time to start thinking about that because all of those exceptions are going to run out
Right.
in 2028.
Yeah, and I've
Is that-
talked to Ed,
And I don't know,
I don't think there's very many left.
I know, but I'm just saying, like, that may be time to start
Right.
thinking about
Yep.
what that means
Bob
for.
owns 6 of them.
we did the same in 1990.
Yeah.
We
When the first one went in.
came
Yeah.
online, yeah, I had the same kind of waiver thing happening for
Yeah.
a while.
Yeah, well, and as a property owner, investing in, like, if they need, that would be another reason for this property not to invest in their septic, because in 5 years.
It's gonna have to.
They have to connect anyway.
Right.
You know, they only have a few more years.
So that, related here, and you brought it up, the municipal connection fees from Lebanon.
Yeah.
I think that's a good piece for this team to factor in their audit, I guess. Because I really would like to understand better what that implies to the average homeowner or someone wanting to build an apartment building, et cetera.
Yeah.
Um,
You should stop. If you want to stop, talk to Jim about it. I mean, he's obviously living and breathing it every day. It's based on how much water you're gonna use. And so that's the key thing. And he's explained it a lot to me. You know, previous town manager was, Ryan Ellsworth was wanting to fight it.
Right.
I think Jack Wasback, our interim,
Didn't want to.
he was an attorney. He looked at it and said, well, this seems reasonable. It's not unreasonable. And I think Jim has also resigned to it too, because there's two ways it can be handled with the city. City could say, we're gonna assess you these development charges, which help pay for sort of the upkeep of the system that they're using for treatment for us. Or they could say, okay, 10 years down the road, we need to treat for PFAS at the Lebanon treatment plant. Enfield, you own 8% of our treatment plant capacity. We're gonna pass on 8% of the cost of the upgrade of the facility to you.
yeah,
So they can't double dip. So it's either one or the other. And I guess they're sort of looking at,
I bet they will.
I bet they will too.
Yeah.
You say they can't double dip.
Yeah.
There's nothing
they
stopping them
will
from
try.
double
Yeah.
dipping, because they're gonna put it on the sewer charge.
They have us over a barrel.
Yeah.
Do they realize that they are absolutely out of control price wise? Do they get that?
Lebanon or
Lebanon,
Enfield.
Lebanon.
I think we both, I mean, everybody
Yeah.
understands. That's getting really expensive.
Well, if you're an average home in the city of Lebanon, water and sewer are fairly reasonably priced. They're,
Right.
they're not out of the world with any other community in the state. You go to Enfield, though.
Yeah.
I've tried to make this point before. Wished, maybe the selectmen could direct someone to actually put the numbers down.
We're paying 100% of the Lebanon charge plus our charge on top of it
Yeah,
for a system they're not maintaining.
and I think we've got to be right at the top of the list.
We are. There's somebody had a list and we were in the top 10, I think.
Yeah, top 10 in the state.
It's not where we want
But
to be.
I think Tim is, it would be good to have clarity on what the agreement is and what the costs are and what that chart is. And I'm sure Jim has that understanding, but I don't think anybody else does.
Yeah.
And,
I don't think the average Enfield resident understands,
well, I guarantee they don't.
No,
and they should.
But I think Tim's also on something like we've always, since 1983, we've had a confusing agreement with Lebanon.
Yes.
That should not be confusing anymore. And we should take steps to eliminate the confusion.
Well, you
it
need to,
got more confused when it got re-upped.
Right.
you need to create a situation where you have to negotiate, where the two parties have to negotiate in good faith.
Right.
And I don't know what that catalyst will be, but,
Right.
It can't just be the city saying, this is what we're going to do.
Right.
Didn't there was a feasibility study for us to build our own system.
Forget that.
And that was-
Forget that. Say that again.
That was the result of the feasibility study.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But you know, that feasibility study was done in the 1980s.
No, they did one like
no,
5
we
years
did
ago.
one about 6-7
And I
years
kept
ago.
saying, there's no point in that study,
Right.
we did it back in the 80s.
Right, exactly, yeah.
But there were people at that time who were like, oh, we could build our own system for cheaper than what we're
The
costing.
feasibility study that would make sense now would be how you have a single sewer system rather than two.
With the city of Lebanon.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and the water system, I think that the whole idea of looking at Shaker Village makes a heck of a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It really does. Yeah, so we'll get these developments in here, and what I'm worried about is that particularly the water supply issue. You can allow a huge development or something like that, eat up all of the capacity. And then everybody wants to add ADUs and everybody has a lot they want to subdivide in town, et cetera. All these things that were density return. They can't move forward.
Right.
So when I took over the water system here and the sewer system, this was 1990. We had a moratorium. You could not connect to the town water. They've been in place for about 10 years. That's not a good place to be. Zach, these things.
Back to
Back
the
to the
notes.
minutes.
I had no changes, just that question.
Sorry.
Yeah,
That was a 12-minute question.
Sorry.
That's okay. It was a good discussion.
It was.
Just get ready to say something.
Anybody else have any questions or
I
comments?
just have a suggestion. Anytime there's an acronym, it'd be helpful for people that read our minutes to know what the acronym is by putting the first version of it in parentheses.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I noticed you pretty much did it, but there's one that Eric talked about, the J something.
Oh, the Johnson.
Yeah.
Johnson, property.
Yeah, that wasn't spelled out, so I wasn't sure what he was talking about there. The JP.
We'll take that. Well, Whitney will get that from this
Okay.
recording. She'll hear that.
Right.
I always try to do it. The first reference,
Yeah, the first
filled out,
reference spelled
and
out.
then in parentheses, the
Yeah.
abbreviation.
Yeah.
And then you can use the abbreviation from there on out.
Anything else? Motion from someone?
I make a motion that we accept the minutes as is.
Motion made. Who's gonna second it? Tim seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions?
And
Right?
Phil with abstention.
Minutes are approved as submitted. Old business rules of procedure discussion. Let me briefly summarize. Rob and Tim and I and Ed Morris, town manager, met for about an hour this morning. We went over the proposed language that Tim had compiled from anybody who wanted to submit changes. There were some significant edits, deletions, and I think Tim and I thought it would be best if Tim went through the notes from this morning's conversation and presented a cleaner document for us to discuss.
Okay.
So that's where we are on that. Not last meeting, but 2 meetings ago, we had talked about the class 6 roads in Lebanon that were being discontinued. The board suggested that we should write yet another letter to Lebanon. Rob did that, and I made a few suggestions. This is where we are as of 8 o'clock tonight. And if anybody has anything they would like to add conceptually or wordsmith wise, now is the time to do it. Otherwise, we will send this off to Lebanon in time for their public hearing, which is next Tuesday, next Wednesday. Next Wednesday.
Looks good to me.
yeah, me too. Learn something new. SAP ladders.
So you've sent this though.
I'll explain
What's
it
that?
sometimes.
Sent this.
We have not sent it yet.
Oh,
We sent one in, 2020.
okay.
Which
And-
the Valley News
That's right.
referenced in their stories.
I
And,
remember that we just told you to send it.
We did,
well,
but
you did say that.
Okay.
However, since
we have time.
since we have the time, since it was done over the last day or two and we're meeting.
Yeah.
Rather than present it as a fait accompli. I thought it would be good for everybody to review it and see if, you
I
know,
like it.
see if there's anything that we should add. And I think accompanying this, we should also send the 2020 letter just for.
Oh, I resent that 2 weeks ago. Yeah, they've got that, but I can certainly,
Let's send it again so that they have a packet of everything from us in the same
speaking
place.
of that, are you planning to attend that? Or you think you can't make that?
I can't, I've got a candidates forum next Wednesday.
Okay. Is anybody available to go to
We all gotta go to the candidates.
that?
I will reach out to Karen Leott Hill, who is a city councilor, and I'll try to bend her ear on it.
I didn't know Tim was mayor of Lebanon.
Has been for quite a while now.
Did not know that.
I know Karen. She's our organist at our Lutheran church. I'll see her on Sunday.
Well, then we'll double team her. I've come to know her through, the Grafton County Democrats.
Okay.
In my campaign. So, yeah, we'll put the screws to her.
I'll hit her up at the coffee hour.
Good. Anything else anybody wants to discuss? Motion?
Make motion, we adjourn.
Second.
Motion made and seconded. All in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, abstentions. We're adjourned at, let's call it 8:07. Good meeting, folks. And we're off and running.
Off and running.
Yep.
Oh, were we gonna talk about master plan with her too?